country where the military wields so much power. The Prime Minister, a general himself, visited the families on Friday afternoon, handing out checks for compensation to the victims' families.
With all the noise and commotion and media attention, it's easy to forget that at the center of this disaster is this building, the daycare center, where 22 children were murdered, and the families that they leave behind.
And the children made one last journey. Coffins from the morgue arriving at a temple near their homes as parents waited outside. So many caskets that names and identities needed to be double-checked. And then the final check and the awful confirmation that this is the final goodbye. Tony Cheng, Al Jazeera, Nong Bua Lampu, northeastern Thailand.
A U.S. school district has suspended its entire police force 5 months after a shooting there killed more than a dozen children. 19 students and 2 teachers died after a gunman opened fire at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas. The attack in May shocked the country, sparking more appeals for gun control. The police department has been under investigation for its slow response to the shooting, including long delays in reaching the gunman while he was holed up in a classroom. Heidi Jo Castro has more on what this means for the school district.
It leaves them with few good options because now they're turning to the Texas State Police to fill in that void to keep their students safe. But that police department is also under investigation for the way that it handled the school shooting back in May. This police force that is run by the school district, there were only 4 officers remaining after the chief was fired in August for his role in responding to the shooting, and 2 others employees were placed on administrative leave.
The Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to a jailed Belarusian activist and 2 rights groups from Ukraine and Russia. It's being seen as a strong condemnation of the war in Ukraine and the presidents of Belarus and Russia. Ukraine's Center for Civil Liberties has been documenting Russian war crimes against Ukrainian civilians. Russian rights group Memorial campaigns on human rights abuses and political prisoners. And jailed Belarusian activist Ales Bialyatsky has campaigned for human rights and civil liberties for nearly 40 years now. Well, those are the headlines this hour. The bottom line with Steve Clemens is coming up next on Al Jazeera.
Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. Who is winning the war in Ukraine? Let's get to the bottom line. The Ukraine war is no ordinary territorial dispute between neighbors. As a wise man said recently, this is going to shape the rest of the 21st century. If Russia loses or doesn't get what it wants, it's going to be a different Russia afterward. And if Russia wins, it's going to be a different Europe afterward. The stakes really couldn't be higher. So what's going on in Vladimir Putin's mind right now? Western media paint him as a leader forced into a corner, facing military setbacks and getting more and more frustrated and desperate. How accurate is that? Last week, we got the view from Washington, and today we're getting the view from Moscow. We're talking with Andrei Kortunov, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. He's one of the country's leading experts in Russian foreign policy and international relations. Andrei, it's great to be with you and talking with you right now on such a sober issue. Let me just ask you, from our perceptions in Washington, and one of the things I want to get into today is how what we're seeing in Washington or think we're seeing in Washington may in fact not align with how things look from Moscow. But as we've seen a new phase in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine basically develop now, what is the dashboard from your perspective in Moscow?
Well, I think that it would be fair to say that there have been 2 major developments recently. The first one was, of course, the decision of the president, confirmed by the Russian parliament, to incorporate the 4 Ukrainian regions into the Russian Federation. And the second one was to launch this partial mobilization, which is an indicator that the special military operation needs some kind of adjustments, that it doesn't bring the results that the Russian leadership was anticipating to get. So I think that these two developments will have at least three major implications for the situation in this conflict. First of all, I think it's now fair to say that any political settlement between Russia and Ukraine is ruled out, at least for the foreseeable future, because you cannot imagine a Ukrainian leadership willing to agree to a major loss of its territory, especially now when Ukraine allegedly has the strategic initiative. It doesn't mean that we will have no negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. There might be negotiations on technical, situational issues. So for instance, some agreements on prisoners exchange. There might be extensions of the grain deal, because this grain deal expires in November. It has to be extended further. There might be some consultations on the safety of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, maybe some other agreements. But I don't think that the Ukrainian side is ready or willing to get back to discuss a political settlement with President Putin. And this is what President Zelensky has already stated quite clearly, that he is ready to negotiate with Russia, but not with Putin. So that's the first implication of what has happened. The second implication is that given the fact that Russia has announced this partial mobilization, and the odds are that in a couple of weeks from now, maybe in a month, maybe in 2 months from now, there'll be major reinforcements getting to the front line. It would be logical for Ukraine to try to use the window of opportunity that they still have in order to make as significant advances on the ground as possible. And this is what we already see within a couple of days. Ukrainians were trying to push hard, both in Donbass and in the south. The messages that we get here are mixed. Of course, the Russian military command claims that most of the Ukrainian counteroffensives failed, but this is yet to be seen. But it's clear that we will see, unfortunately, another cycle of escalation, and we don't know how long this cycle of escalation will last for. And finally, I think that definitely Ukraine will try to use these decisions by the Kremlin in order to seek more support from the West. And the Ukrainian leadership has already made a pitch to join NATO. I think this pitch met a mixed reaction in the West, but nevertheless, they expect to get more military assistance, more intelligence support, more support in training of personnel, and more economic support. So unfortunately, I don't see any light in the end of the tunnel right now. I'm afraid that things are likely to get worse before they can get any better.
How much pain and stress is being felt by Moscow right now over their decisions on Ukraine?
Well, it's also something that has changed dramatically because I think earlier for most people living in Moscow, it was almost like a computer game in the sense that this conflict was far and far away. Of course, Muscovites felt some pain, but this pain was felt primarily by the Moscow middle class, people who go to Western boutiques or supermarkets, fast food chains. Definitely, these are primarily young urban professionals, and they felt unhappy, but they are just a minority. They are not the bulk of the Russian society, and those people who live in small towns or in rural areas, in various national republics in the Russian Federation, they didn't feel this pain significantly. primarily because they do not consume foreign-made goods. They don't go shopping to Western-type malls. And now, of course, it is different because this partial mobilization is something that affects all the regions, and it can affect any family in the country. Not surprisingly, we saw so many people who tried to leave the country. We don't know how many of them, but clearly these are large numbers, maybe hundreds of thousands of people trying to escape this mobilization. Again, I don't think that that constitutes an immediate challenge to the Russian leadership, but definitely this is something that the leadership should keep in mind while planning other actions that might lead to further escalation.
You know, we recently did a show here on The Bottom Line with nuclear experts Corey Shockey from the American Enterprise Institute and John Wolfsthal, who was involved with nuclear and arms control issues in the Obama administration. And they were both rather measured about some of the discussion of a potential use of a tactical nuclear warhead device in this battle. But I'm just sort of interested in not whether President Putin would make that decision or call, but whether or not the consequences of that decision are understood by Russian national security elites, and what Rubicon that would mean that you would be going over.
Well, this is one of the issues which really concern me a lot, because I cannot describe what's going on in the Kremlin. I do not know. But I observe that in the public discourse, there is more and more intention, or at least readiness, to accept a nuclear war. They say that, well, you know, nuclear war is bad, but if it is controlled, if we are talking about the use of tactical, low-yield nuclear weapons, probably this is not the end of the world, and this is something which is affordable. I consider such discussions and such positions to be very dangerous, because, of course, once you embark on this road, it is extremely difficult to stop, even if it is low yield, even if it is just a demonstration use of nuclear weapons somewhere in the Black Sea region or in the Baltic Sea region. But it might lead to an inadvertent escalation. And of course, in the end of the day, it might lead to a strategic nuclear exchange with all the implications that this exchange might bring. So it is dangerous. I think that, of course, it is also clear that all nuclear powers preserve a degree of ambiguity about their nuclear strategies. You do not want to be too explicit about the circumstances under which you might be ready to use nuclear weapons. But I think that it would be in everybody's interest to just exclude the nuclear dimension from this conflict. And I think that any use of nuclear weapons in this conflict will be detrimental to everybody engaged. So that should be avoided. And I think that everybody should reconfirm the statement that was made early this year, I think in January, by the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, that you cannot win in a nuclear war, and that's why you should not start a nuclear war.
One of the interests that I think a lot of us have in the West that are watching this is to say, how did we get here? Why did Russia invade Ukraine? What was essentially the driver of this moment? Is there a perception that flirting with Ukraine with regards to NATO helped draw Russia into its next Vietnam?
Well, I think that the official narrative here is that it is not really a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a conflict between Russia and the West. Many officials in this city argue that Ukraine is not an independent actor. Ukraine exists on a life support system provided by the West. And the perception is that Ukraine would have been defeated, would have capitulated long time ago, if not for the Western assistance. So I think the perception here, and this is the narrative which is presented by the Russian leadership, that the West has been anti-Russian for a very long time, that the West would like, if not to completely destroy Russia, then to weaken it to the extent that Russia would cease to be an independent player in international relations. And Ukraine is just a tool in the capable hands of Western politicians. So this is the narrative which is presented by the Russian leadership.
Do you still agree with that, that essentially what we're seeing now are the aftershocks of many decades later of that Soviet empire, that Soviet space still coming undone?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of my paper. Indeed, I made a point, and I still believe that de facto, the Soviet Union did not disintegrate back in 1991, because though the 15 constituent republics declared their independence and started working on their statehoods, but it was a very long and precarious process. And for a long period of time, the former bits and pieces of the Soviet Union stayed together in terms of the economic transportation infrastructure, in terms of logistics, in terms of the perceptions and mentality. Only gradually we saw a real disengagement. And that's why it was so easy to dissolve the Soviet Union. Nobody really cared that much about these decisions, because many people thought that nothing would change, that they would simply, state this independence and life would go on. But gradually we've observed that various countries have developed very different development trajectories. And if you compare, for instance, Russia and Ukraine, you see that these two parts of the former Soviet Union, which constituted the core of the Soviet Union, gradually started diverging from each other. Maybe it was because they inherited different legacies of the Soviet Union, maybe because they got different leaders, but definitely Ukraine was moving in the direction of Western liberal models, not always consistently, with some setbacks. And even now, Ukraine can hardly be qualified as a mature democracy. But Russia started moving away from liberal models. And we've seen a very clear strategic disengagement between Russia and Ukraine, which, of course, contributed a lot to this conflict.
I'm very interested, Andrei, in how your friends and colleagues in the international affairs circuit are viewing the solvency of the U.S. relationships inside NATO. You and I have attended some of the same conferences. We see, a kind of celebration, if you will, of NATO again in light of responding after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, under their breath, those leaders in Europe will say, we saw January 6th. Things were different under President Trump. We know that America is not as dependable an ally as it once might have been. At least that's their calculation. And I'm interested in whether that is seen as an opportunity in Moscow or a sign of crumbling American influence as compared to ascending American influence.
Well, let me say that within the expert community, at least, nobody questions the fact that we observe an enhanced Western cohesion, that the West has managed to unite itself, partially due to efforts of President Biden, but partially to the decisions made in Europe and also in East Asia. And the main discussion that we have here is about whether this new cohesion is situational, something which was triggered primarily by Russia's actions in Ukraine, and something which is limited to Russia only, something that might end if the conflict is resolved or if the conflict is frozen, or rather we should look at this cohesion as a strategic shift, something that will go beyond Russia, something which will affect Western attitudes to China, to the global South, and something that would last for at least a couple of years. Because depending on whether this cohesion is tactical or strategic, we might have very different trajectories of the global order development. And some say that in 2 years from now, maybe in the United States, you will have another Donald Trump, and that will be the end of the Western unity. Others would say that it's not about